Hey everyone, welcome to Yellowfan. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that The Simpsons is not just the longest running animated show in television history, it is the most accidentally accurate piece of storytelling ever put on screen. For over 3 decades, a group of writers sitting in a room in Hollywood have been putting jokes into a cartoon that, years later, sometimes decades later, stopped being jokes and started being headlines. A president nobody believed in. A virus shipping out of Asia. A pop star flying over a crowd before she ever did it in real life. A government secretly listening to its own people. A corporate takeover written on a background sign. Technology that now sits on your wrist. These were not serious predictions. They were punchlines. Throwaway gags, background details that most people missed entirely on first watch. And yet here we are, living in a world that keeps lining up with what a cartoon drew first. But before we get into all of that, I would just like to kindly ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It is completely free, and it genuinely helps us keep making videos for this community we have been lucky enough to build. Alright, that is enough of that. Let's get into it. The president no one took seriously. There is a moment in television history that people still talk about today, not because it was the funniest thing ever written, not because it had the best jokes or the most memorable characters. People talk about it because when it first aired, everyone laughed. And then, 16 years later, nobody was laughing anymore. The year was 2000. The Simpsons was deep into its 11th season, still one of the most watched shows on television, still cranking out episodes week after week. The writers decided to do something they had done before, take a peek into the future. They had done future episodes before, and fans always loved them. There was something fun about watching the Simpsons family in a world that hadn't happened yet. Flying cars, strange technology, grown-up versions of characters we had watched as kids. It was always a good time. The episode was called Bart to the Future, and it aired on March 19th, 2000. The whole point of the episode was simple. Bart gets a glimpse of what his life is going to look like when he is all grown up, and it is not a pretty picture. He is broke, he is lazy, he is still bumming money off his family members, and sharing an apartment with Ralph Wiggum. Classic Bart. Nothing had changed. The joke was that Bart, despite all his big talk as a kid, ended up going absolutely nowhere. But while Bart's sad future was the main event, the writers quietly slipped something else into the episode. Something that felt like a small background detail at the time. Something that most people probably forgot about the moment the episode ended. In this vision of the future, Lisa Simpson had become the President of the United States. She is sitting in the Oval Office, dressed in a purple pantsuit and wearing her trademark pearl necklace, looking every bit the part of a world leader. She turns to her cabinet and calmly delivers the line that would one day break the internet. As you know, we've inherited quite the budget crunch from President Trump. The audience laughed. Of course they did. The idea of Donald Trump as President of the United States was, at the time, completely ridiculous. That was the whole point. Trump was a famous businessman. He had a golden tower in New York City with his name on it. He was on magazine covers. He was loud, flashy, and everywhere. But the idea of him actually running the country? That was comedy gold. A joke so obvious it almost wrote itself. Dan Greeny, the writer who actually wrote that episode, later spoke about why they picked Trump specifically. He said the idea was to use Trump as a symbol of a certain kind of over-the-top, chaotic energy. The joke was not really about Trump the man. It was about the idea that whoever came before Lisa had left a total mess behind, and Trump felt like the perfect person to represent that chaos. It was meant to be a warning, Greeny said, a satirical little nudge at where things could go if America wasn't careful. He never in a million years thought it would actually happen. And here is where the story starts to get a little strange. Around the time that episode was being written, Donald Trump had actually been looking into running for president. In 1999 and early 2000, Trump put together what is called an exploratory committee, which is basically a formal way of saying he was seriously thinking about throwing his hat in the ring. He was looking at running as a member of the Reform Party, a third-party option in America at the time. He made appearances. He gave interviews. He talked about it publicly. He ultimately decided to walk away from the idea, and the whole thing faded pretty quickly from the public conversation. But the Simpsons writers had clearly been paying attention. They had seen Trump's name circling around the political world, even if it never went anywhere, and so they dropped his name into the episode as a punchline, a future president who had clearly made a mess of things. Funny for about 5 seconds, then forgotten. Then 2015 arrived. Donald Trump came down a golden escalator in Trump Tower in New York City and announced that he was running for President of the United States. Cameras were rolling. Reporters were there. The whole country watched. And most people, at least at first, still treated it as a joke. Pundits laughed. Commentators shook their heads. Political experts said it would never last. Nobody took it seriously. The Simpsons had not taken it seriously either, 15 years earlier. And yet here they were, watching the joke become real in slow motion. November 2016, Donald Trump won the presidential election and became the 45th president of the United States. It was one of the most shocking moments in modern political history. People all over the world could not believe what they were seeing. News anchors looked stunned. Social media exploded. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, people started digging up old clips. Old moments from television and movies that had pointed at this exact outcome. And at the very top of every single list was that scene from Bart to the Future. Lisa Simpson, the Oval Office, the purple pantsuit, the pearl necklace. As you know, we've inherited quite the budget crunch from President Trump. The clip went viral immediately. Millions of people watched it. Millions more shared it. It was everywhere. News outlets covered it. Late-night hosts talked about it. People who had never seen that episode of The Simpsons in their lives suddenly knew exactly what scene everyone was talking about. It had taken 16 years, but the punchline had finally landed. Just not in the way anyone expected. What made it even stranger was the detail about Lisa's outfit. She is wearing a purple pantsuit and pearl necklace in that episode. When Kamala Harris appeared at the 2021 presidential inauguration as Vice President of the United States, she was wearing a purple outfit and pearl necklace. The Simpsons writer Mike Scully was asked about it later and said the purple was probably just a random color choice made by the animators, and that Lisa always wears pearls anyway. So that one was likely just a coincidence on top of a coincidence. But still, the image was hard to ignore. Then came 2024. Trump ran for president again, and this time eagle-eyed fans went back to that same episode and noticed something they had somehow missed before. In the background of one of the scenes, there is a poster, and on that poster, the year reads 2024. Not 2016, not 2020, 2024. Whether that was intentional or just another one of the show's famous background gags that nobody caught for over 2 decades, nobody knows for certain. But the fact that it was there at all added another layer to an already mind-bending story. Trump won again in 2024, becoming the 47th president of the United States. And the clip started circulating all over again. A new generation of people discovering it for the first time. A whole new wave of people asking the same question everyone had been asking since 2016. How did they know? The honest answer is that they probably didn't. Al Jean, one of the longtime producers of The Simpsons, has always been straightforward about this. He has said in interviews that the predictions are really just educated guesses. The show has been on the air since 1989. It has produced over 700 episodes. When you throw that many darts at a wall for that many years, some of them are going to hit. The writers are sharp, well-read people who pay attention to the world around them. They follow politics, they follow culture, they follow trends, and sometimes the trends they pick up on end up going somewhere nobody expected. Bill Oakley, another longtime Simpsons writer and producer, put it even more plainly. He said there are very few cases where The Simpsons actually predicted something. Most of it, he said, is just coincidence. The show is so old and has covered so many topics that history has had plenty of time to loop back around and match up with something the writers once threw in as a throwaway gag. That explanation makes sense. It is the reasonable, rational answer. And most of the time, it is probably exactly right. But then you look at the Trump episode again, and you notice that the writers did not just mention Trump randomly. They chose him specifically because he had already shown interest in running. They chose him because something about his personality and his brand felt presidential in a dangerous, chaotic kind of way. That was the joke they were going for, and they were sharp enough to connect those dots back in 1999, years before most people were thinking about it seriously. Years before Trump himself had fully committed to the idea. That is not pure coincidence. That is a group of very smart, very observant writers looking at the world and seeing something that most people were not seeing yet. They were not predicting the future. They were reading the present better than almost anyone else was. Dan Greene, the man who wrote the episode, said something that has stuck with people. He said the Trump presidency joke was meant as a cautionary tale, a little fictional warning about what could happen if celebrity culture and political life got too tangled up together. The joke was never supposed to be funny in a harmless way. It was supposed to make you a little uncomfortable. It was supposed to make you think about where things were heading. And it did. Just not until it was too late. That is the thing about The Simpsons that makes these moments so fascinating. The writers were not working with crystal balls or secret information. They were working with sharp eyes and a deep understanding of the world around them. They looked at Donald Trump in 1999, a loud, famous, ambitious businessman with political ambitions already on record, and they said, yeah, that guy could be president one day. And they turned it into a joke because at the time, that was all it felt like it deserved to be. The world caught up with the joke in 2016 and again in 2024. Bart to the Future will probably never be remembered as one of the great Simpsons episodes. It is not ranked among the show's best. The Bart storyline is fine but forgettable. Even Lisa's moment in the Oval Office, as historically significant as it turned out to be, is just one small scene in a 22-minute episode that came and went like any other. But that one line, that one throwaway punchline from a cartoon that aired on a Sunday night in March of the year 2000, that line turned into one of the most talked about moments in the entire history of the show. And every time something new happens in the world of Donald Trump and American politics, people go back to that clip. They watch it again. They shake their heads. And they remind themselves that a cartoon somehow got there first. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if you think that is the strangest thing The Simpsons ever saw coming, wait until you hear about the virus that shipped out of Asia and turned the whole world upside down. Section 2. The virus that shipped from Asia. Most people have a very clear memory of where they were when the world shut down. Maybe you were at school and they sent everyone home early. Maybe you were at work and your boss told you not to come back for a while. Maybe you were watching the news and saw city after city going quiet, streets emptying out, shelves in stores being wiped clean of toilet paper and hand sanitizer. The world in early 2020 felt like something out of a movie, a disaster film that nobody had signed up to be in. But here is the thing, The Simpsons had already filmed it, 27 years earlier. The episode was called Marge in Chains. It was the 24th episode of the show's 4th season, and it aired on May 6, 1993. The main story of the episode follows Marge after she accidentally shoplifts a bottle of bourbon from the Quickie Mart and ends up getting arrested and going to jail. That is the A story, and it is a good one. Classic Simpsons. But the episode opens with something that, in 1993, nobody gave a second thought to. A small throwaway scene that set up the background of the whole episode. Homer sees an advertisement on television for a product called the juice loosener. He wants one. He orders it. Simple enough. The scene then cuts to a factory in Osaka, Japan, where workers are busy packing up these juice looseners to ship out to customers in America. And one of the workers is sick. He is sneezing. He is coughing. He is clearly not well. And as he packs the boxes up to ship them off, he coughs and sneezes directly into one of them before sealing it shut and sending it on its way. That box makes its way to Springfield, and when Homer and the rest of the family open it, the sickness inside gets out. It spreads through Springfield almost immediately. People all over town start getting sick with what the news media in the episode calls the Osaka flu. Shops close. People stay home. The town is in rough shape. The whole community is brought to a halt by a sickness that traveled from Asia inside a package and spread through the population before anyone could stop it. In 1993, this was just a setup for a Marge story. A quick and silly way to explain why the town needed Marge so badly while she was locked up, and why everything fell apart without her. Nobody watching that episode that night thought they were watching a warning. Nobody circled that date on a calendar and wrote down, "Remember this." It was background noise, a funny little premise that got the plot moving. Then 2020 happened. In late 2019 and early 2020, a new illness began spreading in the city of Wuhan in China. From there it moved fast. It crossed borders. It got on planes. It traveled through populations the way fire travels through dry grass, moving from person to person before most countries even had time to figure out what they were dealing with. By March 2020, the World Health Organization had declared it a pandemic. By the end of that year, it had reached every corner of the planet. The illness was COVID-19. And the moment news broke that it had originated in East Asia and was spreading through the world through human contact, people started pulling up that old Simpsons clip. The Osaka flu, the factory worker coughing into the box. The sickness arriving in a package from Asia and tearing through an entire community. The parallels were hard to miss. An illness starting in East Asia, spreading through contact, shutting down normal life for an entire town. The Simpsons had drawn almost exactly that picture back in 1993, so casually that most people had completely forgotten the episode existed. The clip spread everywhere online. Millions of people watched it during the early months of the pandemic. Some people thought it was funny, in a dark, uncomfortable kind of way. Some people found it genuinely unsettling. And some people, the ones who had grown up watching The Simpsons, felt that strange feeling you get when something that was always just a cartoon suddenly feels a little too real. Now, it is worth being clear about something. The Osaka flu in the episode and COVID-19 in real life are not the same thing. The Osaka flu in the show is treated as a fairly standard illness. People feel terrible, the town shuts down temporarily, and life moves on. COVID-19 was far more serious than that. According to the World Health Organization, COVID-19 caused over 7 million deaths worldwide. It overwhelmed hospitals. It changed the way people lived, worked, went to school, and said goodbye to loved ones. There is nothing funny about any of that, and the episode was never meant to address anything close to that level of tragedy. But the bones of the story are the same. An illness beginning in East Asia, traveling through shipped goods and human contact, arriving in a community that had no idea it was coming, spreading fast, shutting everything down. In the broadest strokes, The Simpsons episode from 1993 and the real-world events of 2020 are telling the same story. The interesting question is how the writers landed on that setup in the first place. The idea of a disease traveling from Asia to America through a commercial product was not exactly a new idea in 1993. Trade between the United States and Asian countries had been growing for years, and with that growth came a growing awareness that goods weren't the only thing crossing those oceans. Scientists and public health experts had been talking for a long time about the possibility of new illnesses emerging in densely populated parts of Asia and spreading globally through the movement of people and products. It was not a secret fear. It was just not something that had fully broken through to mainstream public conversation yet. The Simpsons writers, as always, were paying attention. They picked up on something that was floating around in the background of the news and the culture, and they turned it into a silly plot device for a Marge episode. They were not trying to make a serious point about global health risks. They were trying to make people laugh. But the seed of the idea came from somewhere real, even if the episode itself played it entirely for comedy. That is actually one of the most important things to understand about The Simpsons' predictions as a whole. Very few of them came out of nowhere. Most of them were rooted in things that were already happening in the world, trends that were already developing, fears that were already being talked about in certain circles. The writers just put those things on screen in a way that felt ridiculous at the time, and then real life eventually caught up. What nobody could have prepared for was the scale of what happened in 2020. The Osaka flu knocked Springfield sideways for a little while. COVID-19 knocked the entire world sideways for years. Schools closed for months. Businesses shut down permanently. Families were separated. People spent months inside their own homes. The global economy took a hit that took years to recover from. None of that was in the Simpsons episode. None of it could have been. But the starting point, that very first domino, a sickness beginning in East Asia and spreading outward through the movement of ordinary goods and ordinary people, was sitting right there in a cartoon from 1993. There is one more detail worth mentioning. Early in the COVID-19 pandemic, there were widespread reports and concerns about the virus potentially traveling on the surfaces of packaged goods that had been shipped from infected areas. Public health experts debated this for months. People were wiping down their grocery deliveries. Stores were putting up signs about packages from overseas. The idea of a virus arriving in a box from Asia and getting out the moment someone opened it was not just a Simpsons plot anymore. For a brief and frightening period of time, it was a real concern that governments and health agencies were actively addressing. Nobody is saying The Simpsons caused this, or that the writers somehow knew exactly what was coming. That would be giving one television show far too much credit, and would honestly miss the point entirely. But what the episode does show is that the people writing The Simpsons in the early 1990s were pulling their ideas from real places. From real conversations happening in real parts of the scientific and public health world. From fears and possibilities that most people in 1993 had no reason to spend much time thinking about. When the pandemic hit, Marge and Chain suddenly felt less like a silly background plot device and more like a piece of accidental documentary filmmaking. A snapshot of a fear that turned out to be completely valid, dressed up in cartoon clothes and surrounded by jokes about Marge going to jail. The episode is not remembered as one of the all-time classics of the show, but it is one of the most talked about episodes in the entire history of The Simpsons. Not because of Marge's story, which is actually quite good, and not because of Homer's juice loosener, which is funny in the way only The Simpsons can be funny. It is talked about because of a sick factory worker in Osaka, Japan, coughing into a box in 1993, and the world that box helped predict 27 years before it arrived. Marge in Chains aired on May 6, 1993. Most people who watched it that night remember it as the episode where Marge goes to prison. A few of them now remember it as something else entirely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if a cartoon predicting a global pandemic from a factory floor in Asia sounds impossible to top, just wait until you see what The Simpsons knew about a certain pop star before she took over the world's biggest stage. Section 3. The Woman Who Flew. Before she flew, on the night of February 5, 2017, somewhere around 117 million people were watching television. Super Bowl 51 was already one of the most dramatic games in NFL history. The New England Patriots had come back from a massive deficit to beat the Atlanta Falcons in overtime, and the night was already full of moments people would be talking about for years. But before any of that football happened, before the comeback and the overtime and all the chaos on the field, there was the halftime show. And the halftime show that night was something that nobody who watched it forgot in a hurry. Lady Gaga stood on the roof of NRG Stadium in Houston, Texas. Below her, the crowd filled the stadium floor. The lights were massive, the stage was enormous, and then, with the whole world watching, she jumped. She came down from that roof suspended by cables, dropping through the air in a glittering silver costume, wires holding her as she descended toward the stage in one of the most dramatic entrances in Super Bowl history. The crowd went absolutely wild. Cameras caught every second of it. The images were everywhere the next morning. Lady Gaga hanging in the air above the crowd, silver and shining and impossible to look away from. It was one of the most talked about halftime performances in years. Spectacular, huge, the kind of moment that gets replayed on highlight reels for the rest of time. And the Simpsons had already done it 5 years earlier. Almost frame for frame. The episode was called Lisa Goes Gaga. It was the 22nd episode of the show's 23rd season, and it aired on May 20th, 2012. It was actually the season finale that year, the last episode before summer, and the concept was simple enough. Lady Gaga, playing a version of herself, arrives in Springfield on her tour train. The town of Springfield is in a dark mood. Everyone is miserable. Everyone is down on themselves. And Gaga, being Gaga, decides that what this town needs is a serious dose of love, positivity, and one very large concert. The episode itself has a mixed reputation among Simpsons fans. It is not usually listed among the show's greatest moments. Some fans find it a bit much, a bit over the top even by Simpsons standards. Lady Gaga's character spends most of the episode trying to lift Lisa's spirits after Lisa becomes the most unpopular kid in Springfield, which is saying something in a town that also contains Bart Simpson. The story is fine. The jokes land here and there. But as a piece of television, most people who remember it at all remember it as one of the more forgettable finales of the show's later years. What nobody paid much attention to was the concert scene. In the episode, Lady Gaga performs for the people of Springfield, and during that performance, she is lifted into the air above the audience, suspended by wires, flying over the crowd in a silver outfit, looking down at the people below as she sings. The image is bold and theatrical, exactly the kind of grand, over-the-top entrance you would expect from Lady Gaga in any context, real or animated. At the time it aired, nobody wrote articles about it. Nobody made videos pointing at it and saying, "Watch out for this one." It was just a cartoon version of Lady Gaga doing exactly the kind of thing Lady Gaga was already famous for doing. Big stages, big costumes, big moments. Nothing about it seemed like a prediction because it just seemed like the show was capturing who she already was as a performer. Then the Super Bowl happened. The morning after Super Bowl 51, when people started pulling up footage of Gaga's halftime show and setting it next to the 2012 Simpsons episode, the reaction was immediate. The image of cartoon Gaga flying over the Springfield crowd in her silver outfit, sitting right next to the image of real Gaga descending from the NRG Stadium roof in her glittering silver bodysuit, was almost too much to take in. The wires, the silver costume, the crowd below, the performer above. The whole visual language of the moment was the same. The clip from the Simpsons episode got pulled up millions of times in the days after the Super Bowl. News outlets covered it. Social media ran with it. And people who had seen the episode when it aired back in 2012 and completely forgotten about it suddenly remembered it with a jolt. Lady Gaga herself was asked about it, and she said something that summed up the whole thing perfectly. She called the comparison spooky. And then she added, with the kind of charm she has always been known for, that it was kind of nice being a Simpsons character before it actually happened in real life. She was right on both counts. It was spooky, and it was kind of wonderful. Now, people have asked whether the Super Bowl performance was inspired by the episode, whether someone on Gaga's team had seen Lisa Goes Gaga and filed away the image of the flying entrance for later use. It is possible. The Simpsons is one of the most watched television shows in history, and Lady Gaga is nothing if not someone who thinks deeply and carefully about how she presents herself on stage. But there is no confirmed connection. No member of her team has ever said they were pulling from the episode, and Gaga herself never claimed it was intentional on her part. The much simpler explanation is that Lady Gaga had already built a career around exactly this kind of theatrical, gravity-defying entrance. Flying over crowds, costumes that made people stop breathing for a second, performances that felt less like concerts and more like events. The Simpsons writers in 2012 were not trying to predict her future. They were just doing what they had always done brilliantly, looking at a real person in the real world, understanding what made that person who they were, and animating it. They took Lady Gaga's established personality and pushed it as far as it could go. And 5 years later, she pushed herself just as far on the biggest stage in the world. What makes the connection so striking is not just the visual similarity, as remarkable as that is. It is the fact that both moments were carrying the same message underneath the spectacle. In Lisa Goes Gaga, the reason Gaga comes to Springfield is to lift people up. The town is struggling. People feel bad about themselves. They feel left out and forgotten and small. And Gaga arrives with this enormous, colorful, thunderous energy, specifically to tell those people that they are worth something, that they belong, that they are seen. The flying entrance, the silver costume, the whole massive production is in service of that message. She is not just putting on a show. She is using the show to reach people who feel like the world has passed them by. The 2017 Super Bowl halftime show carried the same energy. Gaga opened with a medley that built into Born This Way, one of her most famous songs, and one that has always been about belonging, about being accepted for who you are, about not being ashamed of the things that make you different. The performance was widely talked about as a message of unity and inclusion at a time when a lot of people in America were feeling divided and uncertain. The spectacle was enormous, but underneath it was a very simple and very human message. The Simpsons episode got there first, not just with the wires and the silver outfit, with the whole spirit of the thing. Executive producer James L. Brooks, who has been a driving force behind The Simpsons since the very beginning, was involved in the Lady Gaga episode. Getting Lady Gaga to appear on the show at all was a significant deal. She was at one of the highest points of her career in 2012, coming off the massive success of albums like The Fame and Born This Way, and getting her to voice a version of herself for an animated episode was not a small thing. The team put real care into capturing who she was and what she represented, which is part of why the episode, even if it is not remembered as a classic, feels so accurate in its portrayal of her. When you care about getting someone right, you tend to get them right. And when the Simpsons team looked at Lady Gaga in 2011 and 2012, what they saw was exactly what the world would see 5 years later at the Super Bowl. A performer who thought in terms of scale. A performer for whom the sky was never a ceiling, but a stage. There is another small detail that people have pointed out over the years. In the Simpsons episode, Gaga is on a very elaborate custom tour train that serves as both her home and her mode of transportation. It is painted and decorated and entirely over the top, a rolling palace that announces her arrival before she even steps off it. In real life, Lady Gaga has been known for traveling in elaborate, custom-designed ways that match her brand and her image. It is not a one-to-one match with the train in the episode, but it is another example of the writers nailing something true about who she is as a person, not just as a performer. The Simpsons has always been at its best when it looks at real people and real culture and tells the truth about them through the filter of comedy. The Lady Gaga episode did exactly that. It looked at one of the biggest stars in the world and understood something fundamental about her. It understood that she was not just famous, she was a symbol. She stood for something, and whatever stage she stood on, she was always going to fly. 5 years later, she flew. One episode, one concert scene, one moment of a cartoon character hanging in the air above a crowd in a silver outfit. And then the real thing, seen by over 100 million people on the biggest night in American sports. Lisa Goes Gaga aired on May 20th, 2012. Most people who watched it that night remember it as the one where Gaga comes to Springfield and helps Lisa feel better about herself. A few of them, now, see it as something else. A preview. A rough draft of a performance that the world was not ready for yet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if Lady Gaga flying over a crowd 5 years before she actually did it has you shaking your head, just wait until you hear what the Simpsons knew about your government long before your government was ready to admit it. Section 4. They were already listening. Most people like to believe that their private conversations are private. When you call a friend late at night to vent about your day, you assume that conversation belongs to you and that friend and nobody else. When you send a message, you assume it travels from your phone to theirs without anyone in between reading it along the way. That feeling of privacy, the quiet confidence that nobody is paying attention to your personal life, is something most people carry around without ever really thinking about it. It just feels like a basic part of living in a free country. For a long time, the idea that your own government might be secretly listening to those conversations was the kind of thing that got you laughed out of a room. Conspiracy theory territory, tinfoil hat stuff, the kind of claim that serious people did not take seriously because the idea was just too large and too dark to sit comfortably next to normal everyday life. Then 2013 arrived, and a man named Edward Snowden changed everything. But before we get to Snowden, we need to go back to 2007. Because 6 years before Snowden told the world what was really happening, a cartoon already had. The Simpsons movie came out on July 27, 2007. After nearly 2 decades on television, the show finally made the jump to the big screen, and it was a massive event. Fans had been waiting for years. The film earned over $500 million worldwide at the box office, and was one of the most talked about movies of that summer. It is remembered fondly by most Simpsons fans as a genuinely great piece of work, a film that captured what made the show special and blew it up to movie size without losing what made it feel like home. The plot of the movie involves Springfield getting into serious environmental trouble after Homer dumps a silo full of pig waste into the town's lake. The government gets involved. The Environmental Protection Agency, led by a villain named Russ Cargill, decides that Springfield has become too much of a problem and places a giant glass dome over the entire town, sealing everyone inside. The Simpsons family escapes before the dome comes down and spends the rest of the movie as fugitives, trying to save the town and fix the mess Homer made. It is a fun, funny, fast-moving movie, and buried inside it, played largely for laughs, is a scene that in 2013 would stop being funny entirely. At one point in the film, the government is trying to track down the Simpson family. They need to find Marge and the kids, who are hiding somewhere outside of Springfield. And the way they find them is by using the NSA, the National Security Agency, to listen in on a phone call. A large room full of government workers with headphones sits at rows of equipment, all of them listening to the private phone calls of ordinary American citizens at the same time. When one of them finally hears Marge's voice on the line and pinpoints her location, the whole room erupts in celebration. The scene is played as a joke. The workers are overly enthusiastic in a funny way, celebrating like they just scored a touchdown when all they did was find a woman on the phone. The surveillance itself is presented as something so enormous and so casually accepted within the world of the movie that it barely registers as alarming. It is just there, part of the background, another piece of an overpowered and slightly ridiculous government machine. Audiences in 2007 laughed at it, because in 2007, the idea that the government was sitting in rooms listening to millions of ordinary people's phone calls was still, for most Americans, the kind of thing that only happened in movies and cartoons. It was satire, an exaggeration of government overreach for comic effect. Nobody walked out of the Simpsons movie that summer thinking they had just watched a documentary. Then came June 2013. Edward Snowden was a government contractor who had worked for the NSA, the same organization that the Simpsons movie had turned into a punchline 6 years earlier. In June 2013, Snowden leaked a massive collection of classified documents to journalists at The Guardian and The Washington Post. What those documents revealed shook the world. The NSA had been running secret programs that collected phone records and internet data from millions of ordinary American citizens without their knowledge. Not just suspected criminals, not just people under investigation, ordinary people. People making ordinary calls and sending ordinary messages, going about their daily lives with no idea that any of it was being swept up and stored by their own government. The scale of the surveillance was enormous, far larger than most people had imagined was even possible. The reaction was immediate and fierce. People were furious. Politicians argued about it for months. Civil liberties groups raised alarms. Other governments around the world expressed outrage when they found out their own citizens had been caught up in the dragnet as well. Snowden himself fled to Russia to avoid prosecution and has lived there ever since. The conversation he started about privacy, government power, and the rights of ordinary people is still going on today. And the moment the story broke, people went back to the Simpsons movie. The clip of the NSA scene circulated everywhere. A room full of government workers listening to millions of phone calls at once. Finding a regular family by tapping into their private conversation. All of it presented so matter-of-factly that it barely even registered as alarming within the world of the film. In 2007, it was a joke. In 2013, it was a description of something that had actually been happening in the real world. The parallel was not subtle. It was not one of those situations where you have to squint and tilt your head to make the connection work. The Simpsons movie had shown a government agency conducting mass surveillance on ordinary citizens and using it to track down a private family. 6 years later, the world found out that a government agency had been conducting mass surveillance on ordinary citizens. Full stop. The cartoon had not exaggerated. If anything, the reality turned out to be bigger than the joke. What is worth thinking about is where the writers of the Simpsons movie got the idea from in the first place. The concept of government surveillance was not invented by the film. Fears about government overreach and the idea of authorities listening to private conversations had been present in American culture for a long time. Wiretapping as a practice dated back decades. There had been major scandals in American history involving the government spying on its own citizens. The Church Committee hearings in the 1970s had already exposed serious abuses by intelligence agencies. Authors like George Orwell had been writing about government surveillance as a tool of control since the middle of the 20th century. By the mid-2000s, in the years after the September 11th attacks, the government had significantly expanded its ability to gather information in the name of national security. Laws had been passed, programs had been put in place. Some of this was reported on in pieces by journalists, though the full picture was nowhere near public knowledge. But for anyone paying close enough attention, the direction things were heading was not invisible. The machinery was being built. The Simpsons writers looked at that machinery, understood where it was pointing, and drew it on screen as a comedy set piece. They were not whistleblowers. They were not insiders with classified information. They were sharp, well-read writers who absorbed the world around them and filtered it through the lens of satire. And the thing about good satire is that it often tells the truth louder and more clearly than straight journalism does, because it is not bound by the same rules of what it can say and how. The NSA scene in the Simpsons movie is not a long scene. It does not take up a huge amount of the film's running time. It is there to serve the plot, to give the government a way to locate the family, and to get a laugh from the audience along the way. But within those few minutes, the film captured something that the actual news had not yet reported. A government with ears everywhere, listening without permission, finding you when you thought you were invisible. Snowden himself later tweeted about the Simpsons movie scene after his leaks became public. He simply wrote that The Simpsons did it first. Coming from the man who actually exposed the real program, that is about as clear a stamp of accuracy as you can get. What makes this particular prediction land differently than some of the others is the weight of what it was predicting. A funny disease name is one thing. A pop star flying over a crowd is one thing. But mass government surveillance of ordinary citizens is something with real consequences for real people. It is a topic that gets into questions about freedom and trust, and what kind of relationship people have with the governments that are supposed to serve them. The Simpsons movie did not treat it with that kind of seriousness because it is a comedy, and comedies are not required to do that. But it put the image on screen. It showed the room. It showed the headphones. It showed the agents celebrating when they locked onto a private call. And then the real room was revealed to the world. There is something quietly remarkable about the fact that a cartoon made for laughs captured this particular truth before any major news outlet did. Not because the writers were somehow better at finding hidden information than investigative journalists, but because satire has always had a special relationship with uncomfortable truths. Satire can say things that other forms of storytelling cannot, because it wraps the hard stuff in a joke and slips it past the part of your brain that wants to reject difficult ideas. You laugh first, you think later. In 2007, audiences laughed. In 2013, they thought. The Simpsons movie is still remembered as a great film and a worthy chapter in the long history of the show. Most people who love it remember the dome, the pig silo, Homer's spider pig, and the scene where he rides a motorcycle around the inside of a giant ball. Those are the moments that live in pop culture. But somewhere in there, tucked between the jokes and the adventure, was a room full of people with headphones listening to everything you say. The movie showed it to the world in the summer of 2007. The world found out it was real in the summer of 2013. 6 years apart, one cartoon. One of the biggest intelligence scandals in American history. The Simpsons did it first. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if the government listening to your phone calls feels like the darkest thing on this list so far, hold that thought, because the next one is about money, power, and one of the biggest business deals in the history of the entertainment industry. A deal that The Simpsons somehow saw coming more than 20 years before anyone signed a single piece of paper. Section 5. The Sign on the Wall. In 1998, somebody on the writing team of The Simpsons made a joke that the people running two of the biggest entertainment companies in the world would not have found funny at all. It was a small joke, the kind you could miss entirely if you looked away from the screen for a second. It appeared on screen for just a moment, a quick visual gag tucked into the background of a single scene, and then it was gone. Most people who watched the episode that night almost certainly did not notice it. The ones who did probably chuckled and moved on. Nobody stopped the tape and said, "This is going to matter one day." Nobody circled anything in a calendar. It was just another one of the show's famous freeze frame gags, the kind of tiny background joke that rewarded the people paying close attention while letting everyone else stay focused on the main story. 21 years later, that joke became one of the most talked about moments in the entire history of the show. because what the writers had scribbled on a sign in the background of a 1998 episode turned out to be an accurate description of the real world. The episode was called When You Dish Upon a Star. It was the 5th episode of the show's 10th season, and it aired on November 5th, 1998. The story follows Homer after he accidentally stumbles upon the secret vacation home of two major Hollywood celebrities, Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger, who were married to each other at the time. Ron Howard is also there. Homer, being Homer, cannot keep a secret to save his life, and he ends up trying to use his new famous friends to launch his own career in the entertainment industry. Things go badly. They always go badly for Homer. At one point in the episode, Homer makes his way to the Fox studio lot in Hollywood. He is trying to pitch a project. He walks up to the gate of the studio, and there in the background on the wall of the building is a sign. The sign reads, 20th Century Fox, and underneath that, in smaller letters, it reads, a division of Walt Disney Company. That was the joke. In 1998, Fox and Disney were two completely separate companies. More than that, they were competitors. They operated in the same industry, fighting for the same audiences, the same box office dollars, the same television ratings. The idea of Disney owning Fox was, at the time, the kind of corporate scenario that would have seemed completely far-fetched to anyone working in Hollywood. These were two massive, powerful, independent entertainment giants. They were not merging. They were not combining. They were rivals. So the sign was funny because it was absurd. Disney swallowing up Fox like a small fish being eaten by a very large, very family-friendly fish. It was a joke about how big and hungry big corporations could get. The kind of sharp, satirical dig at the entertainment industry that The Simpsons had always been great at. Haha, Disney owns everything. Very funny. Moving on. Except they were not moving on. They were moving forward. Into exactly the future that sign described. The story of how Disney actually came to own Fox is one of the biggest business stories of the past decade. It did not happen overnight, and it did not happen simply. For years, media companies all over the world were watching the entertainment industry change rapidly. Streaming services were growing. The old ways of doing business were being disrupted. Companies that had been comfortable and powerful for generations were suddenly having to think hard about how to stay relevant. And one of the ways big companies stay relevant in moments like that is by getting bigger. In late 2017, Disney and 21st Century Fox announced that they had reached an agreement for Disney to buy a large portion of Fox's assets. The deal covered Fox's film studio, its television production arm, various cable networks, and international properties. It was an enormous transaction, one of the biggest in entertainment history, and it set off a battle. Because another company, Comcast, came in with a competing offer and tried to buy Fox out from under Disney. Disney won. After months of back and forth, Fox accepted Disney's improved offer. The final price tag was approximately $71 billion. The deal was formally completed in March 2019. When it closed, the implications were immediate and wide-ranging. Fox's movie studio, responsible for decades of major films, was now a Disney property. The television production side of Fox, which had produced some of the most successful shows in American history, now answered to Disney. And sitting right there among all of those assets, one of Fox's most famous and longest-running television properties was The Simpsons. The show that had joked about Disney owning Fox in 1998 was now, 21 years later, actually owned by Disney. The moment people made the connection, it spread everywhere. The image of that sign from the 1998 episode was pulled up and placed next to news headlines about the completed merger, and the reaction from people online was the same mixture of disbelief and laughter that tends to follow every major Simpsons. Prediction. It was funny and strange and slightly mind-bending in the way that only The Simpsons can be. What makes this one a little different from some of the other predictions on this list is how directly it applies to the show itself. When The Simpsons predicted a Trump presidency, that was the outside world catching up to a cartoon joke. When The Simpsons predicted the NSA surveillance program, that was a real-world secret being accidentally described by a comedy film. But this one was the show predicting its own future. The Simpsons made a joke about the company that aired The Simpsons being bought by Disney, and then Disney bought the company that aired The Simpsons. The show essentially predicted its own acquisition. That is a level of accidental self-awareness that is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. The writers of that episode were not making a serious prediction about corporate mergers. They were poking fun at the idea of media consolidation, the way big companies tend to absorb smaller ones and put their name on everything. Disney was already known by 1998 as a company with a massive reach, a company that had expanded far beyond animation into theme parks and television networks and merchandise that covered every surface of every child's bedroom in America. Making a joke about Disney eventually putting its name on Fox was a way of saying that no company, no matter how big or independent it felt, was safe from that kind of growth. The joke was rooted in something real, which is always where the best Simpsons gags come from. The entertainment industry had been consolidating for years before that episode aired. Companies were merging, studios were being bought and sold. The lines between different parts of the industry were blurring. The writers saw that trend and stretched it out to its most extreme conclusion for a quick laugh. And then real life spent the next 2 decades slowly walking toward that conclusion until it arrived. The Simpsons itself was affected by the deal in ways that went beyond just changing who owned the company. When Disney completed the purchase of Fox's assets, it suddenly found itself in possession of a huge library of content that included some things that did not fit neatly into Disney's traditional brand. The Simpsons, a show famous for edgy humor and sharp satire, was now technically a Disney property. So was a lot of other Fox content that had never been aimed at the kind of family-friendly audience Disney had built its reputation on. The company had to figure out what to do with all of it. The answer was Disney Plus, the streaming service Disney launched in November 2019, just months after the Fox deal closed. The entire back catalog of The Simpsons, all of the seasons, hundreds and hundreds of episodes, went onto Disney Plus as one of the platform's biggest draws at launch. People subscribed specifically to watch old Simpsons episodes. The show that had joked about becoming a Disney property in 1998 was now one of the most prominent pieces of content on Disney's own streaming platform. The sign on the wall in that 1998 episode described all of it. Not in detail, obviously. Not with dates or dollar amounts or streaming services, just a name on a building. A small, throwaway visual gag that read, 20th Century Fox, a division of Walt Disney Company, and was on screen for a second or two before the story moved on. Ron Howard, who appeared in the episode as himself, has talked about being involved in that episode over the years. He has always been a good sport about it. The whole episode has a fun, affectionate energy toward the Hollywood world it is making fun of. The jokes about the film industry and celebrity culture are sharp but not mean-spirited, and the little background sign about Disney and Fox is completely in keeping with that energy. It is a quick satirical jab, there and gone, not belabored, not hammered home. The show trusted its audience to catch it, and the audience did catch it, eventually. 21 years later, when the news broke that the deal was done, and Disney had completed one of the biggest corporate acquisitions in entertainment history, people who had grown up watching The Simpsons remembered that sign. They went back and found it. They watched it again and thought about a room full of writers in 1998 putting a tiny joke in the background of a Homer episode that would one day describe reality more accurately than anyone could have imagined. The sign on the wall. The joke that became a headline. The cartoon that described its own future and then had to live inside it. When You Dish Upon a Star aired on November 5th, 1998. Most people who watched it that night remember it as the one where Homer hangs out with famous celebrities and ruins everything. A few of them remember a sign in the background that, for a couple of seconds, described the future of an entire industry. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if The Simpsons predicting a $71 billion corporate merger with a background gag has you questioning everything, just wait until you find out what a cartoon wristwatch from 1995 ended up telling us about the technology sitting on your wrist right now. Section 6. The future on your wrist. Think about what you did this morning. Maybe you woke up and checked the time on the small screen strapped to your wrist. Maybe you got a notification on that same screen, a message or an alert, without ever reaching for your phone. Maybe you made a quick call from it, or asked it a question out loud and got an answer back. Maybe you used it to track your steps, check your heart rate, or pull up directions to somewhere you were going. If any of that sounds familiar, then you are living inside something that a cartoon episode from 1995 already described in detail. Not approximately, not in a vague general way that requires some creative interpretation to connect the dots. In detail. The episode was called Lisa's Wedding. It was the 19th episode of the show's 6th season, and it aired on March 19th, 1995. It is remembered by most Simpsons fans as one of the truly great episodes of the show's golden era, a genuinely sweet and funny story that holds up beautifully even now. The setup is simple and charming. Lisa visits a fortune teller at a Renaissance fair, and the fortune teller shows her a vision of her future, specifically a vision of a romance she will have when she is a young woman in college. The future the episode imagines is set in the year 2010. That detail matters because 1995 and 2010 are 15 years apart, which means the writers were trying to picture a world that felt genuinely far away at the time. Far enough that they could fill it with technology and ideas that seemed like reasonable science fiction for that moment. And what they came up with, almost casually, as window dressing for Lisa's love story, was a vision of everyday technology that turned out to be startlingly close to what actually arrived in the years that followed. The most talked about piece of technology in the episode is the wristwatch. Lisa's boyfriend in this future vision, a British student named Hugh Parkfield, wears a watch that does considerably more than tell the time. He talks into it. He makes phone calls from it. It opens up and functions like a small communication device strapped directly to his wrist. In 1995, that image belonged firmly in the world of science fiction. Watches told the time. Fancy ones also told the date. The idea of a watch that you could speak into, that could connect you to other people, that could function as a standalone communication tool, was not something that existed anywhere outside of movies and TV shows set in the distant future. The show presented it as completely normal. Hugh does not make a big deal of his watch. Nobody in the episode stops to marvel at it or explain how it works. It is just there, part of everyday life in the year 2010, the same way a regular wristwatch was part of everyday life in 1995. That casual presentation is actually one of the most accurate things about it, because when smartwatches eventually arrived in the real world, that is exactly how they were adopted. Not as miraculous, mind-blowing pieces of technology that people treated with reverence, just as useful things that people started wearing and using and eventually could not imagine being without. The Apple Watch launched in 2015. It was not the very first smartwatch to exist, but it was the one that made the technology mainstream, the one that brought it to millions of people and made it part of daily life. You could receive calls on it. You could send messages. You could ask it questions using your voice. You could track your health. By 2025, over 200 million smartwatches were shipping every year worldwide. The watch that Hugh Parkfield wore in a cartoon 30 years ago had gone from a science fiction prop to one of the most common pieces of personal technology on the planet. But the smartwatch was only one part of what Lisa's wedding got right about technology. The same episode also featured video calling. Not as a rare high-tech tool that only important people had access to, as a normal, everyday thing that regular people use to talk to their families. At one point in the episode, Lisa calls her mother Marge using a device that shows both of them on screen while they talk. They can see each other's faces. They react to each other in real time. The connection is slightly glitchy, which is a funny small detail because video calls in real life are also sometimes glitchy, especially when you have bad reception or a slow connection. The whole exchange feels completely natural within the world of the episode. Lisa and Marge are just having a regular mother-daughter conversation, and the fact that they can see each other while doing it is treated as no more remarkable than the way people in 1995 picked up a telephone. In 1995, video calling did not exist for ordinary people. There had been experiments and prototypes going back decades, technology demonstrations at world fairs and corporate presentations, but as something that regular families used to talk to each other from their own homes, it was not there yet. The infrastructure for it was not in place. The devices were not in people's hands. Skype launched in 2003. FaceTime launched in 2010, the same year the episode had imagined as its future setting. Zoom, which most of the world learned to use during the 2020 pandemic, launched in 2013. Video calling went from a cartoon fantasy in 1995 to something that billions of people used every single day by the 2020s. Parents talked to their kids at college on it. Grandparents met their grandchildren through it. People held work meetings, birthday parties, funerals, and first dates on it. The technology that Lisa and Marge used so casually in that animated future world became one of the defining communication tools of real modern life. FaceTime specifically is worth pausing on for a second. It launched in 2010, the exact year that Lisa's wedding had set its future story. The episode predicted video calling for everyday families and set that prediction in 2010. Apple launched FaceTime in 2010. That alignment is genuinely difficult to explain away as pure coincidence, even though the people who made the episode had no way of knowing what Apple would or would not release in 15 years. What the episode also captured, in a way that goes beyond any specific piece of technology, was the spirit of how technology would change communication. The world the episode imagined was not one where people were amazed by their devices or spending all their time thinking about how remarkable it was to live in the future. The characters in that 2010 world were just living their lives, using their tools, connecting with the people they loved. The technology was in the background, helpful and present, but not the point of anyone's day. That is exactly what happened. When smartphones and smartwatches and video calling went from new and exciting to just part of everyday life, they stopped being marvels and started being ordinary. Your parents stopped thinking it was remarkable that they could see your face on a screen. Your grandparents stopped mentioning how different things were from when they were young. The technology folded itself into daily life so completely that it became invisible, which is exactly how the episode had portrayed it 30 years before it happened. There is a fun detail in the episode that shows up when you look closely at the watch Hugh wears. It has a slightly old-fashioned quality to it, even though it is supposed to be futuristic. It flips open like an old-school phone, rather than having a simple flat-screen face the way actual modern smartwatches do. That design choice makes sense when you remember that the writers were working in 1995, when the flip phone was an exciting piece of new technology. The most advanced handheld communication device most people had seen at that point was a phone that flipped open, so naturally the writers imagined a watch that did the same thing. They got the function exactly right and the form slightly wrong, which honestly seems pretty reasonable for a cartoon making a 15-year prediction about technology that did not exist yet. There were other pieces of technology in the episode worth mentioning. Characters in that imagined future world wore what appeared to be something close to virtual reality headsets for entertainment purposes. In 2024, Apple released the Vision Pro, a spatial computing headset designed for entertainment, communication, and productivity at a price of $3,499. The episode imagined VR headsets as a casual home entertainment item 30 years before a major technology company put one on the market. The show's imagined future had people using these devices the same way it had them using their watches and making their video calls, without making a big fuss about it. The episode also briefly showed characters with devices that functioned somewhat like early tablets, flat screens used for reading and looking things up, years before the iPad arrived in 2010 and changed the way people thought about portable screens. What is remarkable about all of this, when you look at it together, is how consistent the picture is. The writers of Lisa's Wedding were not randomly throwing future technology at the wall to see what stuck. They were imagining a coherent world where communication had become faster, more personal, and more visual, where the distance between people had been shrunk by devices you could carry on your wrist or hold in your hand, where talking to someone far away meant being able to see their face. That central idea, that technology would bring people closer together by making communication more immediate and more human, turned out to be exactly right. Al Jean, one of the longest-serving writers and producers on The Simpsons, has talked about the technology predictions in the show over the years. He has always been careful to explain that the writers were not trying to invent the future. They were extrapolating from trends they could already see. Smartwatches and video calling and wearable technology were being discussed in tech and science circles in the early 1990s. They were not mainstream conversations, but they were happening. The writers picked up on those conversations and asked the simple question that good writers always ask: what happens if this keeps going? What does ordinary life look like when these things are no longer experimental? The answer they came up with in 1995 was the world most people live in today. Lisa's Wedding is still considered one of the best episodes The Simpsons ever made. It is remembered primarily as a love story, a genuinely touching look at Lisa's future and the relationship she has with her family. The technology in it is set dressing, background detail meant to make the future feel real. Most people who love that episode love it because of how it handles Lisa's emotions, not because of what Hugh's watch can do. But that watch, and that video call, and the way two people could see each other's faces across any distance on a small screen as if it were the most natural thing in the world. In 1995, that was a cartoon dream. In 2010, that was FaceTime. In 2025, that is just Tuesday. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if a 30-year-old cartoon predicting the technology on your wrist right now has your mind moving, wait until you hear about the time Homer Simpson sat down at a chalkboard and accidentally got closer to one of the most important scientific discoveries in human history than most people on Earth ever will. Section 7. The equation on the chalkboard. Homer Simpson is not supposed to be smart. That is kind of the whole point of him. He is lovable and funny and one of the most iconic characters in television history. But intelligence is not the first thing that comes to mind when you think about what makes Homer, Homer. He forgets things constantly. He makes terrible decisions on a daily basis. He has, on multiple occasions, demonstrated that his brain does not work the way most brains are supposed to work. There is an entire running gag across many seasons of the show built around the idea that Homer once had a crayon pushed so deep into his brain that it was physically making him less intelligent. That is the level of mental horsepower we are dealing with here. And yet, in a 1998 episode of The Simpsons, Homer Simpson stood in front of a chalkboard and wrote down an equation that came surprisingly close to predicting one of the most significant scientific discoveries of the 21st century. 14 years before some of the smartest people on the planet confirmed the discovery using one of the most expensive and complicated machines ever built by human hands, Homer had something close to the answer scrawled in chalk on a board in his basement. The episode was called The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace. It was the second episode of the show's 10th season, and it aired on September 20th, 1998. The story follows Homer going through a kind of personal crisis. He has just turned 38 years old, and he has done the math on his life and come to the unhappy conclusion that roughly half of it is already gone. He has not accomplished much. He has not left a mark on the world. He has not done anything that history will remember. This realization sends him into a full spiral, the kind of deeply relatable midlife panic that The Simpsons has always been brilliant at capturing, with exactly the right mix of sadness and comedy. Looking for a way to turn things around, Homer stumbles across a biography of Thomas Edison in the library. For those who need a quick reminder, Thomas Edison was one of the most famous inventors in American history, the man behind the practical light bulb, the phonograph, and hundreds of other inventions that changed daily life in the late 19th and early 20th century. Edison was also famous for working at an extraordinary pace, churning out invention after invention throughout his career with a kind of restless, driven energy. Homer reads about Edison and immediately decides that he wants to be just like him. He is going to become an inventor. What follows is a series of wonderful Homer moments. He invents a shotgun that blasts makeup directly onto someone's face, which he calls the makeup gun. He invents an electric hammer. He invents a chair with a built-in toilet, designed for people too lazy to get up during their favorite television show. These are exactly the kinds of inventions you would expect from Homer Simpson. They are ridiculous, funny, and somehow also slightly understandable given Homer's particular priorities in life. But in the middle of all this inventing, there is a scene where Homer is standing in front of a large chalkboard in his basement working. He is writing out a long, complicated mathematical equation, the kind that fills most of the board and looks completely out of place coming from a man who once forgot his own wife's name in a moment of stress. The equation is there as a visual gag. The joke is the contrast between who Homer is and what is written on that board. He looks completely at home writing it, focused and serious, before going back to whatever nonsense he was working on. Most people who watched that scene laughed at the contrast and moved on. One person who did not move on was a British science writer named Simon Singh. Singh had spent years writing about mathematics and science for general audiences, making complicated ideas accessible to people who had not spent their lives studying them. He wrote a book called The Simpsons and Their Mathematical Secrets, published in 2013, in which he went through decades of Simpsons episodes and identified all the genuine mathematics hidden inside them. His central argument was that The Simpsons, over its long history, had employed a number of writers with serious backgrounds in mathematics and science, and that those writers had quietly loaded the show with real mathematical content disguised as background details and throwaway gags. When Singh got to the chalkboard scene in The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace, he stopped and worked out the equation Homer had written. And what he found was remarkable enough that it ended up being one of the most talked about parts of his book. The equation, when worked through, produces a number. That number represents a predicted mass for a particle called the Higgs Boson. Homer's calculation landed at approximately 775 giga-electron volts, which is a unit of measurement used by physicists when talking about the mass of extremely small particles. Now, before going any further, it is worth taking a moment to explain what the Higgs boson actually is in the simplest possible terms, because understanding why this matters requires knowing just a little bit about what it is. The Higgs boson is a particle. Everything in the universe is made of particles. the air around you, the device you are reading this on, your own body, all of it is made of incredibly tiny building blocks. Scientists have spent the better part of the last century trying to understand what all those building blocks are and how they work together. One of the big questions in that effort was about mass, about why some particles have weight and others do not. The answer, according to a theory developed in the 1960s by a physicist named Peter Higgs, along with several other scientists, involved a specific particle that would essentially be responsible for giving other particles their mass. A particle that, if it existed, would help explain one of the most fundamental things about how the physical universe is put together. The problem was that for decades, this particle was entirely theoretical. Scientists believed it should exist. The mathematics pointed toward it existing. But actually finding it, actually creating conditions where it could be observed and measured, required technology that did not exist yet. It required a machine so large and so powerful that it took decades to plan, billions of dollars to build, and the cooperation of thousands of scientists from countries all over the world to operate. That machine was the Large Hadron Collider, built by an organization called CERN in Switzerland. It is the largest scientific instrument ever constructed by human beings, a circular tunnel running roughly 17 miles underground, used to accelerate particles to extraordinary speeds and smash them together so that scientists can study what happens in the wreckage. In July 2012, after years of experiments using this machine, scientists at CERN announced that they had found the Higgs Boson. They calculated its mass at between 125 and 127 giga-electron volts. Homer's equation from 1998 had predicted 775 giga-electron volts. That is higher than the actual number, roughly 6 times higher, which is a significant gap by the standards of precise scientific measurement. Singh was careful about this in his book. He did not claim that Homer had perfectly predicted the Higgs boson. He said that Homer had come up with a calculation that pointed in the right direction and produced a number that was in the same general universe as the real answer, particularly impressive given that the calculation was done 14 years before. The particle was actually observed, and that the person who wrote it down was a cartoon. What makes the story even more interesting is the reason the equation was there at all. The Simpsons had, throughout its history, employed several writers with genuine backgrounds in mathematics, physics, and computer science. David X. Cohen, one of the key writers and producers on the show, who later went on to create Futurama, had studied physics at Harvard and computer science at Berkeley. Al Jean, the longtime showrunner, had studied mathematics at Harvard. Several other writers had similar backgrounds. These were not people who had simply taken a few science classes. They were people who had spent years studying these subjects at the highest level before ending up in television comedy. The equation on Homer's chalkboard in The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace was not random. Someone on the writing staff put real mathematical content on that board. They were not just drawing squiggles to make it look like Homer was doing complicated work. They wrote an actual equation using real components from real physics, including things like the speed of light and other fundamental measurements that physicists actually use when working on problems in particle science. The result of that equation, when worked through properly, produced a number that turned out to be in the same neighborhood as one of the most important measurements in the history of scientific discovery. Singh noted that if the person who wrote the equation had set it up slightly differently, specifically if they had not included a particular element at the start of the calculation, the result would have been even closer to the real number landing, at around 99 giga-electron volts, rather than 775. That would have been remarkably close. Close enough that calling it a near miss would not be an overstatement. As it stands, 775 is further away, but still points unmistakably in the direction of the actual answer. Peter Higgs, the physicist who first theorized the existence of the particle that now bears his name, and his colleague Francois Englert, won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2013 for their work developing the theory. It was one of the most celebrated scientific achievements in decades. Thousands of scientists at CERN had spent years working toward the moment when the particle could finally be confirmed. It was the culmination of half a century of theoretical work and years of painstaking experimental effort. Homer wrote something close to the answer in 1998, while trying to be more like Thomas Edison, in between inventing a toilet chair and a makeup shotgun. The contrast between those two facts will probably never stop being funny. What the episode actually reveals, underneath the comedy of it all, is just how deep the mathematical knowledge ran inside the Simpsons writing room. For most viewers, the chalkboard in that scene is pure visual comedy, a dumb man writing smart-looking things. A joke about Homer being out of his depth, except he looks completely comfortable. The laugh comes from the gap between the person and the equation. But for anyone who actually worked through what was written on that board, the laugh came from somewhere else entirely. From the realization that whoever wrote those symbols knew exactly what they were doing. The Simpsons has always been a show that rewarded attention. The freeze frame gags, the background details, the small jokes that flew by too fast for most people to catch in real time, but became legendary once people started pausing their recordings and looking more closely. The Higgs Boson equation is part of that tradition. It was not meant to be seen as a prediction. It was meant to be a visual joke for the few people watching who happened to know enough mathematics to recognize what was on the board. 14 years later, CERN found the particle. And the chalkboard that Homer Simpson had been writing on in his basement during a midlife crisis turned out to have had something real on it all along. The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace aired on September 20th, 1998. Most people who watched it that night remember it as the episode where Homer tries to be like Thomas Edison and invents a bunch of useless things. A very small number of people noticed the equation. An even smaller number worked it out. And then a decade and a half later, one of the greatest scientific discoveries in modern history made that chalkboard worth a second look. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if Homer Simpson accidentally brushing up against one of the biggest moments in the history of physics is not enough to make you think twice about what this show has been quietly putting on screen all these years, wait until you hear about the time a cartoon correctly called 3 Super Bowl winners in a row before any of the games had even been played. Section 8. 3 in a row. There is a version of The Simpsons prediction story where everything can be explained away. The Trump episode? Trump had already shown political ambitions in public, so the writers were just connecting obvious dots. The virus episode? Disease outbreaks had happened before, and the fear of one coming from Asia was already floating around in scientific conversations. Lady Gaga flying over a crowd? She was already famous for exactly that kind of theatrical, over-the-top performance. The Disney and Fox sign? Media consolidation was already happening across the industry. You can build a reasonable argument for all of them. You can look at each one and say the writers were sharp, well-read people who saw trends developing and ran with them. That is a fair and honest thing to say. But then you get to Lisa the Greek, and the reasonable explanations get a little harder to hold on to, because this one was not about trends. It was not about reading the political landscape or understanding where the technology was heading or knowing that big companies tend to get bigger over time. This one was about a specific sporting event, a single game. One team against another team on one particular day, and the episode called the winner 3 times in a row. The episode was called Lisa the Greek. It was the 14th episode of the show's 3rd season, and it aired on January 23, 1992. The story is one of those warm, genuinely lovely Simpsons episodes from the early golden years of the show, the kind that wraps a real emotional core inside a funny and fast-moving plot. Homer has been neglecting Lisa. He has been too caught up in his own world to spend meaningful time with his daughter, and Lisa, being Lisa, feels it. She is lonely and a little hurt, the way only a kid who genuinely wants to connect with their parent can be lonely and hurt. The unlikely bridge between them turns out to be football. Homer is obsessed with betting on football games. He watches them constantly, studies them, lives and breathes the outcomes. And when he discovers, almost by accident, that Lisa has an extraordinary and completely unexplained gift for predicting which team is going to win, his eyes light up. Lisa, who knows almost nothing about football and has no particular interest in it, can somehow look at a matchup and tell you who is going to win with remarkable accuracy. Homer starts using her predictions to place bets. He wins. He keeps winning. For a little while, the two of them find a genuine connection built on the most unlikely foundation imaginable. The emotional story is really good. It is one of those early Simpsons episodes that reminds you the show was always capable of making you feel something real underneath all the jokes. But what turned Lisa the Greek into a piece of television history had nothing to do with the emotional story. It had to do with what Lisa predicted during the episode. With the Super Bowl approaching, Homer asks Lisa who is going to win. Lisa thinks about it, considers both teams, and gives her answer. She says the Washington Redskins are going to win. The episode aired on January 23, 1992. Super Bowl 26 was played 3 days later on January 26, 1992. The Washington Redskins played the Buffalo Bills. The Redskins won. 3 days. The episode called the winner of a real Super Bowl 3 days before the game was played. Now at this point, you might be inclined to say that is lucky. 50-50 chance on any given Super Bowl, one team or the other is going to win, and the show happened to pick the right one. That is a fair observation. One correct pick does not make you a prophet. It makes you someone who got a coin flip right. But here is where the story gets considerably more interesting. The producers of The Simpsons decided to do something clever when the episode was scheduled to be rerun the following year. They went back into the episode and redubbed Lisa's dialogue. They replaced her Washington Redskins prediction with a new prediction, one that reflected the teams playing in that year's upcoming Super Bowl. The episode was rerun shortly before Super Bowl 27 in January 1993, and in the new version, Lisa predicted that the Dallas Cowboys were going to win. The Dallas Cowboys played the Buffalo Bills in Super Bowl 27. The Cowboys won. 2-2. The following year, it happened again. The episode was rerun once more, the dialogue was redubbed again, and Lisa made a new prediction. This time, she called the San Francisco 49ers. The San Francisco 49ers won their Super Bowl. 3 predictions, 3 correct picks. 3 years in a row of a cartoon character calling the winner of the biggest sporting event in America before the game was played. The chance of picking 3 Super Bowls correctly in a row is 1 in 8. That is not impossible. That is not even particularly unlikely, mathematically speaking. It is the same as flipping a coin and getting heads 3 times in a row, which happens to people all the time without anyone calling it a miracle. So there is a version of this where you shrug and say they got lucky 3 times and move on. But the story does not feel like luck when you are watching it. It feels like something stranger than that, because these were not just random guesses. Each time the episode was rerun with redubbed dialogue, the people making those changes had to commit to a pick. They had to choose one team, put Lisa's voice behind that choice, and let it air on national television before the game happened. If they had gotten it wrong, the episode would have become a footnote about the time The Simpsons called the wrong Super Bowl winner. Instead, they got it right every single time. The original prediction, the Washington Redskins pick in 1992, was written before the Super Bowl was played. The writers of the episode had to pick someone, and they picked the Redskins. At that point in the 1991 NFL season, the Redskins had been one of the best teams in football, finishing with a very strong record and entering the Super Bowl as a clear favorite. So the original pick was an educated guess based on real information about how the season had gone. It was not a blind dart thrown at a board. The subsequent redubs operated the same way. Each year before the rerun aired, the people making the decision looked at the matchup, considered which team appeared stronger going into the game, and made a call. They were essentially doing what sports analysts and betting experts do every year before the Super Bowl, taking in the available information and making a prediction. The fact that they happen to be right 3 years running is partly skill, partly knowledge, and partly the kind of fortune that tends to smile on people who are paying close attention. What makes Lisa the Greek so special in the long history of Simpsons predictions is how immediate and verifiable it is. Most of the predictions on this list operated over years or even decades. The Trump episode aired in 2000, and the presidency came in 2016. The NSA scene was in 2007, and the real story broke in 2013. Those are long gaps, long enough that the connection can sometimes feel a little abstract, like looking at two things separated by time and working hard to find the line between them. With Lisa the Greek, the gap was 3 days, and then it happened again the next year, and the year after that. There was no ambiguity about whether the connection was real. It was right there, sitting in front of everyone, undeniable. A cartoon called the Super Bowl winner 3 times in a row. Full stop. No squinting required. No creative interpretation needed to make the parallel work. The Buffalo Bills, it is worth noting, appeared in the Super Bowl for 3 consecutive years during this period, and lost each time. They are one of the most famous examples in sports history of a team that reached the biggest game of the season multiple times and could not break through. The episode, in 2 of its 3 versions, featured the Bills as the losing team, which is exactly what happened in reality. The Bills went to 4 consecutive Super Bowls and lost all 4, which is a kind of painful sports history that no amount of cartoon prediction could have prepared the people of Buffalo for. There is a lovely detail in the emotional story of the episode that connects back to the predictions in a meaningful way. At the end of Lisa the Greek, Homer has come to realize that he values his relationship with Lisa more than he values the money he wins from betting on her predictions. The two of them are watching the Super Bowl together, father and daughter, and Lisa looks at Homer and asks him what will happen to their relationship if she predicts wrong. Homer looks at her and says that it will not matter, that he loves her regardless of whether she gets the picks right. The episode ends with Lisa making her prediction, and the team she picks wins. But the point of the episode, the real emotional point, is not the win. It is the moment of connection between Homer and Lisa. The idea that the football and the betting were just a vehicle for 2 people who love each other to find their way back to each other. The Super Bowl predictions are the part that people remember and talk about, but the heart of the episode is about something much simpler and much more permanent than sports. It is about a father and a daughter. It is about the ways people sometimes stumble into connection through the most unexpected doors. The show got 3 Super Bowl winners right while telling that story on the side. Lisa the Greek originally aired on January 23, 1992. Most people who know about it remember it as the episode where Lisa predicts football games and Homer bets on them. Simpsons fans remember it as one of the sweeter episodes from the early seasons, a warm story about Homer and Lisa finding common ground. And sports fans remember it as the episode that called 3 Super Bowls in a row before anyone played a single snap. 1 for luck, 2 for attention, 3 in a row on national television for something that nobody quite has a word for yet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if correctly predicting 3 straight Super Bowl winners sounds like the most unexpectedly specific thing on this list, just wait until you hear about the time The Simpsons made a joke in 1996 about 2 completely different musical acts ending up on the same stage, and then had to wait 28 years for the world to finally catch up. Section 9. The joke that took 28 years to land. Most jokes have a shelf life. A punchline that lands perfectly on a Tuesday night in front of a live audience tends to lose something when you try to tell it again 6 months later. Context changes. The moment passes. What was funny in one room at one time becomes a story you are telling about something that used to be funny, which is a completely different thing. Humor is tied to the moment it lives in, and most of the time, when that moment is gone, the joke goes with it. But every once in a while, a joke gets told and then sits there quietly for years, waiting for the world to catch up to it, waiting for reality to slowly arrange itself into exactly the shape the joke described. And then one day, without warning, the punchline arrives. Not in the room where the joke was first told, not for the audience that first heard it, for an entirely new audience in an entirely new time who suddenly realize they are living inside a setup that was written 28 years ago. That is what happened with a single throwaway line from a 1996 episode of The Simpsons. A line so small and so quick that it barely registered as a joke at all. A line that most people who heard it laughed at briefly and then completely forgot. And then, in 2024, that line became real, almost word for word, in front of a live audience, at one of the most famous music venues in the world. The episode was called Homerpalooza. It was the 24th episode of the show's 7th season, and it aired on May 19, 1996. The story follows Homer after he realizes he has lost touch with youth culture. His kids are embarrassed by his taste in music. He feels old and out of touch, and completely invisible to the younger generation. In an attempt to prove that he is still cool and still relevant, Homer gets himself to a massive outdoor music festival, a clear reference to the real Lollapalooza festivals that had been running since the early 1990s and had become one of the defining cultural events of that era for young people. The festival in the episode features several real bands voicing animated versions of themselves. The Smashing Pumpkins appear, Sonic Youth appear, Peter Frampton appears, Cypress Hill appear. The whole episode is built around the collision between Homer's outdated idea of what cool music sounds like and the actual landscape of mid-90s rock and alternative music. It is a sharp, funny episode with a lot of genuine affection for the music it is poking fun at. The kind of episode that works both as comedy and as a kind of time capsule of what youth culture looked and sounded like in 1996. Cypress Hill, for anyone who needs a quick refresher, were one of the most famous rap groups in America at that time. They had come up out of Los Angeles, built a reputation for a heavy, slow-rolling sound, and become known both for their music and for being very publicly associated with the idea of smoking marijuana. This association was not subtle. It was a central part of their public image and their brand, and it had been from almost the beginning of their career. By 1996, when Homerpalooza aired, this was well established and well known to basically anyone who had been paying attention to popular music. The London Symphony Orchestra, on the other hand, is one of the most prestigious and formally celebrated music ensembles in the world. Founded in 1904, it has spent over a century performing classical music at the highest possible level. Playing in the finest concert halls, collaborating with the most celebrated composers and conductors, and representing everything about music that is considered serious, refined, and deeply traditional. The Royal Albert Hall, where they frequently perform, is one of the most famous concert venues on the planet, a grand and historic building in London that has hosted royalty and world leaders and some of the greatest musical performances in history. The gap between Cypress Hill and the London Symphony Orchestra in terms of image, sound, culture, and every other measurable dimension was about as wide as it is possible for a gap between two musical acts to be. They existed at completely opposite ends of the musical and cultural spectrum. One was loud, irreverent, and deeply embedded in the world of hip-hop and counterculture. The other was formal, venerated, and deeply embedded in the world of classical tradition and high culture. Putting them together on the same stage was not a thing that existed in any realistic conversation happening in 1996. It was not a collaboration that anyone was seriously pitching or planning or even idly imagining, which is exactly what made it such a perfect joke for The Simpsons. In the episode, there is a quick backstage scene at the festival. An announcement is made over the intercom, directed at the performers waiting to go on. The voice on the intercom says, in the casual, slightly exasperated tone of a festival organizer dealing with a logistical problem, that somebody has ordered the London Symphony Orchestra, possibly while high. And then it says, directly and pointedly, that it is looking in Cypress Hill's direction. The joke is there and gone in seconds. It does not linger. Nobody builds on it. It is a quick, sharp gag built entirely on the absurdity of imagining that Cypress Hill, under certain circumstances, might have accidentally arranged for the London Symphony Orchestra to show up at a rock festival. It is funny because the pairing is so completely ridiculous. It is funny because of everything the two acts represent, and how completely different those things are. And it is funny in the specific, rapid-fire way that The Simpsons in its prime was always firing off jokes. Quick enough that if you blinked, you missed it, but perfectly constructed enough that if you caught it, it landed hard. The writers got the laugh. The episode aired. People moved on. 28 years passed. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed live with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall in London. Not a small show. Not an experimental late-night event in some underground venue. At the Royal Albert Hall, one of the most storied and respected concert venues in the world. Cypress Hill on stage with a full symphony orchestra, performing together in front of a live audience, in the city where the London Symphony Orchestra has played for over a century. The reaction online was immediate and enormous. The clip from Homerpalooza spread everywhere the moment the concert was announced, and then again when it actually happened. People who had not thought about that episode in decades suddenly remembered that exact backstage scene. News outlets covered the connection. Music fans who had never particularly followed The Simpsons found themselves watching a clip from a 1996 cartoon and shaking their heads at how precisely the joke described something that would happen in the real world 28 years later. Cypress Hill themselves were aware of the connection. They had been aware of it for years, actually. In various interviews over the decades, members of the group had talked about The Simpsons episode and their appearance in it with obvious affection. Being on The Simpsons, even as a brief animated version of yourself in a single episode, has always carried a certain cultural weight, a signal that you have reached a level of fame and recognition that the show considers worth including. Cypress Hill had earned that inclusion in 1996, and they had always seemed proud of it. When the Royal Albert Hall concert was being planned and came together, the Simpsons connection became part of the conversation around the event almost immediately. The joke from 1996 was suddenly not just a piece of trivia from an old episode. It was context. It was a story that gave the concert an extra layer of meaning and made it even more talked about than it would have been on its own terms. And on its own terms, it was already remarkable. The concert was a genuine creative event, a collision between two wildly different musical worlds that somehow produced something people genuinely wanted to see and hear. The idea that rap music and orchestral classical music could exist together on the same stage in a way that was exciting and real and worth a ticket to the Royal Albert Hall was its own story, independent of anything The Simpsons had ever said about it. But The Simpsons had said something about it in 1996, with a 2-second throwaway joke that the writers almost certainly tossed in because it was the funniest possible version of explaining why a rap group might accidentally book an orchestra. They were not imagining a real future collaboration. They were painting a ridiculous picture for a quick laugh. The ridiculous picture turned out to be a real one. What makes this particular prediction feel different from some of the others is how specific it is without being about anything serious. The Trump prediction was about politics. The pandemic prediction was about global health. The NSA prediction was about government power and citizens' rights. Those are weighty subjects with real consequences for real people. The Cypress Hill and London Symphony Orchestra moment is about something much lighter. It is about music and humor and the absurd and wonderful ways that culture can evolve in directions nobody predicted. There is something almost joyful about this one. Something that makes you smile rather than sit with complicated feelings. The Simpsons made a joke about an impossible musical pairing, and then the world spent 28 years slowly, quietly making that pairing possible and real. Nobody was trying to make the joke come true. Cypress Hill was not chasing down the London Symphony Orchestra to fulfill a cartoon prophecy. The London Symphony Orchestra was not watching old Simpsons episodes and thinking about how to make a rap collaboration happen. It just happened. The way things sometimes just happen when culture moves and shifts and surprises everyone. The writers of Homerpalooza were working with something real, even in that tiny gag. Cypress Hill's association with a certain kind of enhanced state of mind was well documented. The idea of someone in that state making a booking decision that resulted in a formal orchestra showing up at a rock festival was not a random absurdity. It came from a real place, from a real understanding of who these people were and how they lived their public lives. The joke was sharp because it was rooted in something true, even if the specific outcome it described seemed completely impossible. 28 years is a long time to wait for a punchline. It is longer than some of the people who attended that Royal Albert Hall concert have been alive. It is long enough that the writers who put that joke in the episode may not have immediately connected their own work to the news when it broke. Long enough that a whole generation of Simpsons fans had been born, grown up, and become adults without ever having seen Homerpalooza before the concert reminded them it existed. But the joke was still there. It had been sitting in that episode since May 19th, 1996, patient as anything, waiting for Cypress Hill and the London Symphony Orchestra to finally share a stage and give it the ending it had always been pointing toward. Homerpalooza aired on May 19th, 1996. Most people who love it remember it for Homer getting hit by cannonballs and becoming a sideshow attraction, which is genuinely one of the funnier subplots in that season. A few people remember the bands, and one very specific group of people remember a 2-second backstage announcement about an orchestra and a rap group and a question about who placed the order. In 2024, everyone remembered it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if waiting 28 years for the world to catch up to a cartoon joke sounds like the longest gap on this list, do not worry. The next one only took about 15 years. But what it predicted, a fish with 3 eyes found living near a nuclear power plant, is one of those moments where reality arrives looking so much like the cartoon version that you genuinely have to stop and ask yourself how any of this is possible. Section 10. The Fish with 3 Eyes. Some things are funny until they are not funny anymore. A cartoon fish with 3 eyes is funny. It is the kind of visual gag that works immediately and completely, requiring no explanation and no setup. You see it and you laugh because it is absurd, because fish do not have 3 eyes, because the image is so cleanly ridiculous that your brain just accepts it as a joke and moves on. 3 eyes on a fish. Ha! Classic cartoon logic. Next joke, please. And then one day, someone pulls a 3-eyed fish out of a river near a nuclear power plant in Argentina. And suddenly the cartoon fish is not quite so funny anymore. The episode was called 2 Cars in Every Garage and 3 Eyes on Every Fish. It was the 4th episode of the show's 2nd season, and it aired on November 1st, 1990. The title itself is a reference to a famous political slogan from American history, a promise of prosperity and abundance, And the episode uses that idea as a backdrop for a story about politics, power, and the way people with money and influence try to avoid being held responsible for the damage they cause. The episode opens with Bart and Homer fishing in the river near the Springfield nuclear power plant, the same plant where Homer works as a safety inspector despite being spectacularly unqualified for the job. It is a calm, ordinary fishing scene for about 30 seconds, right up until Bart pulls something out of the water that is distinctly not ordinary. The fish on the end of his line has 3 eyes, not 2, 3. A perfectly formed third eye sitting right there in the middle of its forehead, looking out at the world with the same blank, watery expression that fish tend to have regardless of how many eyes they are working with. The fish gets named Blinky. The name alone is funny, a cheerful little name for something that should probably be alarming. Blinky becomes the center of a news story in Springfield, the kind of story that raises uncomfortable questions about what exactly has been going into the river near the nuclear plant and what that might mean for the town and the people living in it. The plant's owner, the deeply unpleasant and endlessly wealthy Mr. Burns, finds himself in trouble. The three-eyed fish is bad publicity. It suggests that his plant has been leaking something into the water that it should not be leaking. It suggests that corners have been cut and rules have been bent, and that the river, and possibly the people who live near it, are paying a price for the way Mr. Burns runs his operation. Burns decides the best way out of his problem is to run for governor of the state. His thinking is simple and completely in character for him. If he controls the government cannot come after him. He launches a political campaign, gets surprisingly far on the strength of his money and his ruthlessness, and seems to be on the verge of actually winning until the night he has dinner at the Simpsons house as part of his campaign. Marge serves the three-eyed fish. Blinky ends up on a plate in front of the cameras, and when Burns tries to eat it and show the world that the fish is perfectly safe and delicious, the moment backfires spectacularly. His campaign falls apart. The three-eyed fish is the engine that drives the whole story. Without Blinky, there is no news story, no Mr. Burns political campaign, no dinner scene, no collapse. Blinky is the catalyst. And Blinky is funny in the way that the best Simpsons visual gags are funny, clear and immediate, and slightly unsettling underneath the laugh. The unsettling part is what turned out to matter. In 2011, fishermen working near the Embalse nuclear power plant in the province of Córdoba, Argentina, pulled a fish out of the water. The fish had 3 eyes. It was a wolffish, a species native to South America, and there, on its head, alongside its 2 normal eyes, was a third eye that had no business being there. The fish was caught in a reservoir close to the nuclear plant, and the images of it spread around the world almost immediately. It was the kind of story that the internet was made for, strange and visual and impossible to look away from. A real three-eyed fish near a real nuclear plant, looking for all the world like a photograph of Blinky that someone had taken in a river in Argentina instead of drawing on an animation desk in Hollywood. The reaction was exactly what you would expect. The Simpsons comparisons were instant and everywhere. The clip from 2 cars in every garage and 3 eyes on every fish got pulled up and placed next to the news photographs, and the parallel was hard to argue with. A three-eyed fish near a nuclear power plant in a cartoon from 1990. A three-eyed fish near a nuclear power plant in real life in 2011. 21 years apart. Scientists who looked at the Argentine fish were careful about drawing direct conclusions. The relationship between nuclear facilities and mutations in nearby wildlife is a subject that scientists approach with considerable care because the actual mechanisms are complicated and the evidence does not always point in clean, simple directions. The Embalse plant had been operating for decades by the time the fish was found, and whether the plant was specifically responsible for the fish's condition, or whether something else in the water had caused it, was not something that could be established with certainty based on a single unusual fish. What could be established was that the fish was real, that it had 3 eyes, and that it was found near a nuclear facility. All 3 of those facts were also true of Blinky, the cartoon fish from 1990. The show had drawn a picture of something, and the world had eventually produced a version of it. As with most of the predictions on this list, the real version came with complications and context that the cartoon version did not have to deal with, because cartoons do not have to deal with scientific nuance. But the image was the same. The idea behind Blinky, the idea that a nuclear power plant leaking waste into a nearby waterway could produce strange mutations in the animals living in that water, was not invented by the writers of The Simpsons. This was a real fear in 1990, and it had been a real fear for decades before that. The connection between nuclear facilities and environmental contamination had been a subject of public debate and scientific study since the earliest days of the nuclear industry. Communities near nuclear plants had raised concerns for years about what might be getting into local water supplies and what effects it might be having on local wildlife. The Simpsons writers were pulling from a real conversation that was happening in the real world. They took a genuine public concern about nuclear power and the environment, wrapped it in the most visually extreme and immediately funny image they could come up with, and built an episode around it. A fish with 3 eyes. The joke works because it is ridiculous. It works because it takes the abstract fear of nuclear contamination and makes it concrete and visible in the most cartoonish possible way. You cannot miss a 3-eyed fish. You cannot argue about whether it looks concerning. It is sitting right there with its extra eye, making the invisible visible. That is actually one of the things The Simpsons has always done brilliantly. Taking fears and concerns that live in the background of public life, the kind of worries people carry around without quite articulating, and giving them a face. The 3-eyed fish is a perfect example of that. The worry about what nuclear plants might be doing to local environments was real and documented and being discussed in the early 1990s. Blinky gave that worry a name and a face and a funny, sad, slightly haunting physical form. When the real 3-eyed fish showed up in Argentina in 2011, it did the same thing. It took an abstract concern and made it impossible to look away from. The photographs of that fish traveled around the world and reminded people of conversations about nuclear facilities and the environments around them that tend to get buried under the weight of economic arguments and political considerations. A strange-looking fish from a South American reservoir made more people think about nuclear power and environmental safety than a dozen dry news reports would have. Blinky beat it to the punch by 21 years. There is a detail in the original episode that is easy to overlook but worth paying attention to. When Blinky is first caught and the news story breaks, the response from the people in power is not alarm, it is spin. Mr. Burns does not look at the 3-eyed fish and say, "There is a problem we need to fix." He looks at it and starts calculating how to manage the story and neutralize the damage. His entire approach to the problem is about perception rather than reality. He is not concerned about what might actually be wrong. He is concerned about how things look. That dynamic, the gap between what powerful people say about environmental problems and what they actually do about them, was part of the commentary the episode was making in 1990. It was pointed and specific and rooted in real observations about how industries and governments tended to respond to environmental concerns. The fish was the joke. The response to the fish was the sharper point. The episode ends with Burns failing to eat the fish in a convincing way in front of the cameras. His spin does not work. The image of a man who owns a nuclear plant trying to smile and chew down a 3-eyed fish on television is too much for the public to accept. He loses the election. There is something satisfying about that ending. The idea that sometimes a single image is powerful enough to cut through all the money and spin and management in the world. Blinky has become one of the most recognizable symbols in the entire history of The Simpsons. Not because the episode is necessarily the show's greatest work, though it is a genuinely strong piece of television from a genuinely strong era of the show, but because the image stuck. A cartoon fish with 3 eyes, swimming in a river near a smoking nuclear tower, has lodged itself in the cultural memory in a way that most characters and images from even the best television shows never managed to do. Blinky is a shorthand now, a way of referring to a whole category of concern about industry and environment and the things that end up in the water when nobody is looking closely enough. 2 cars in every garage and 3 eyes on every fish aired on November 1st, 1990. Most people who love it remember it as the Mr. Burns political campaign episode, the one where he tries to become governor and ends up undone by a plate of fish at the Simpsons dinner table. It is a great episode, sharp and funny and politically observant in all the ways the show was at its best during those early seasons. And somewhere in the river near the Springfield nuclear power plant, Blinky swims, 3 eyes open, watching. 21 years later, somewhere in a reservoir in Cordoba, Argentina, something was swimming that looked an awful lot like him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if a 3-eyed fish pulled from the water near a real nuclear plant is not enough to make you sit with the strangeness of all of this, the next one is going to feel different again. Because it is not about a fish, or a politician, or a pop star. It is about a piece of paper, a background poster, and a film that nobody had announced yet. Section 11. The poster in the background. There is a certain kind of Simpsons moment that requires a pause button to find. The show has always been full of them. Tiny details buried in the background of a scene, visible for a second or two before the camera moves on, designed for the small number of people watching closely enough to catch them. A sign in a shop window. A headline on a newspaper that a background character is holding. A poster on a wall that has nothing to do with the main story happening in the foreground. These details are a signature of how the show has always been made, layered with small rewards for the audience members willing to pay close attention, while everyone else follows the main plot. Most of these background details are jokes that exist entirely in the moment. They are funny if you catch them, irrelevant if you miss them, and forgotten by everyone regardless within a few weeks of the episode airing. They are not meant to last. They are not meant to mean anything beyond the laugh they generate in the second or two they are visible on screen. And then occasionally, one of them turns out to describe something real. Something that had not happened yet. Something that, at the time the episode aired, had no reason to exist anywhere except as a throwaway gag on a background poster that most people watching never even noticed. The episode was called The Ziff Who Came to Dinner. It was the 14th episode of the show's 15th season, and it aired on March 14th, 2004. The story follows Artie Ziff, a recurring character in the show played by Jon Lovitz, who is one of the more memorable one-note characters the show ever created. Artie is Marge's former prom date, a man who has never quite gotten over the fact that Marge chose Homer instead of him. He is self-absorbed, dramatic, and deeply convinced of his own importance. In this particular episode, Artie has fallen on hard times. His technology company has collapsed. He is being investigated for fraud. And rather than face his problems like an adult, he has decided to hide in the attic of the Simpsons' house, living up there quietly and hoping nobody notices. Homer eventually discovers Artie in the attic. Complications follow, as they always do when Homer gets involved in anything. The plot moves fast, the jokes land well, and the episode does what Simpsons episodes do, takes a slightly absurd premise and finds the funny and occasionally touching moments inside it. It is a solid episode from a period of the show that does not always get enough credit, and Artie Ziff is always a welcome presence because Jon Lovitz brings a very specific energy to the character that is hard not to enjoy. But the main story of the episode is not why anyone talks about the Ziff who came to dinner today. They talk about it because of what is on a poster in the background of one brief scene. At some point during the episode, there is a moment where the camera passes across a background detail, a poster. On that poster is an advertisement for a film called Matrix 4. The poster shows Keanu Reeves, the star of the Matrix film series, wearing a Santa hat. The implication of the Santa hat is clear. It is suggesting that this Matrix 4 film would be a holiday release, the kind of movie that comes out around Christmas and targets the large audiences that go to cinemas during the festive season. The poster is on screen for a blink. It is background noise. It is exactly the kind of thing that 99% of people watching the episode when it first aired in March 2004 did not register at all. Their eyes were on the main characters doing the main story things. The poster was wallpaper, a piece of visual texture that made the scene feel lived in without anyone having to pay attention to it. Here is why that poster matters. In March 2004, when that episode aired, the Matrix franchise appeared to be finished. The original Matrix film had come out in 1999 and had been one of the most talked about and culturally influential films of that entire era. It had changed the way people thought about action films, about visual storytelling, about science fiction. It had introduced images and ideas that immediately became part of how people talked about movies and about culture more broadly. It was a phenomenon. 2 sequels followed. The Matrix Reloaded came out in May 2003. The Matrix Revolutions came out in November 2003. Both films arrived to enormous audiences and considerable debate about whether they lived up to the original. The consensus that formed over time was that the sequels were ambitious and visually spectacular, but that they had not quite matched the clean, powerful impact of the first film. By the time The Matrix Revolutions finished its run in late 2003, most people who followed the film industry assumed the story was over. The trilogy was complete. The Wachowskis, the filmmakers behind all 3 movies, had not announced any plans for a 4th installment. There was no indication from anyone connected to the franchise that the story was going to continue. The Matrix 4 poster in The Ziff Who Came to Dinner was not based on any real announcement or any real plan. It was a joke. A quick visual gag about Hollywood's tendency to keep making sequels to anything that had ever made money, regardless of whether the story actually needed to continue. The joke was essentially, of course there will be a Matrix 4, because that is what Hollywood does. It keeps going and going until there is nothing left. It was a satirical comment about the film industry wrapped in a 2-second background detail that almost nobody caught. 17 years passed. In 2021, The Matrix Resurrections was released, the 4th Matrix film. Directed by Lana Wachowski, starring Keanu Reeves, picking up the story in ways that surprised and divided audiences around the world. The film had been announced in 2019, 16 years after The Matrix Revolutions had seemingly concluded the story, and the announcement itself had been enough to send people back to dig up the poster from the 2004 Simpsons episode. But the announcement alone was not the most striking part. The most striking part was when the film came out. The Matrix Resurrections was released on December 22nd, 2021. December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas. Right in the heart of the holiday season. The exact time of year that the Santa hat on the poster in the Simpsons episode had been pointing at. Not just the existence of a 4th Matrix film, but the timing of its release had been sitting in the background of a Simpsons episode 17 years before it happened. The poster had suggested a holiday release through the most direct possible visual shorthand, a Santa hat on the face of the film's star. And the actual film had come out during the holiday period, released specifically to take advantage of the large audiences that go to cinemas in the days around Christmas. When people made this connection, the reaction was the same mixture of disbelief and laughter that tends to follow every major Simpsons prediction. But this one had an extra quality to it that set it apart slightly from the others. Because with something like the Trump prediction or the NSA prediction, you could trace the logic of how the writers got there. You could see the thread of reasoning, the cultural observations, the trends they were picking up on and extending into the future. Sharp, well-read people paying attention to the world and making educated guesses about where things were heading. With the Matrix 4 poster, that thread of reasoning is much harder to find. Hollywood sequels and franchise continuation were already a known phenomenon by 2004. The joke about Matrix 4 existing was easy enough to make because the pattern of Hollywood endlessly extending profitable franchises was already visible and had been for years. The satirical point being made was not particularly subtle. Of course they will make another one. They always make another one. But the Santa hat is harder to explain away. The decision to put a Santa hat on the poster's version of Keanu Reeves to suggest specifically a holiday release for this imaginary fourth film was a specific creative choice that someone in the writer's room made for reasons that probably had more to do with making the gag funnier than with any genuine prediction about when the film would come out. A Santa hat is a quick and simple way to signal Christmas. Putting it on an action hero is funny because of the contrast. That is almost certainly all it was. A visual joke about the contrast between Keanu Reeves' Matrix persona and a holiday hat. And then the real film came out on December 22nd. The Simpsons creative team, the writers and animators and producers, have been asked about the Matrix 4 poster in various contexts over the years since the connection was made. The honest answer from everyone involved has always been the same one that tends to come up whenever these moments surface. Nobody planned it. Nobody knew. It was a background gag built on an assumption that turned out to be correct, dressed in a visual detail that turned out to match reality in a way that nobody sitting in that writer's room in 2004 could have anticipated. What the poster does reveal, underneath the spooky coincidence of it all, is how deeply the writers understood the patterns of the film industry. They knew that Matrix 4 would eventually exist, not because they had inside information about what Warner Brothers was planning, but because they understood how Hollywood worked well enough to bet on it. Franchises do not end. Stories that made money always come back. Stars get older and studios get ambitious. And what once seemed like a completed trilogy becomes the first 3 chapters of something larger. This was already true in 2004. The writers saw it and made a joke about it. They were right about the existence of the film. They were right, through a visual detail that might have been entirely accidental, about when it came out. And they got both of those things right 17 years before anyone outside of Warner Brothers had any reason to believe a 4th Matrix film was coming. There is something almost dizzying about the specificity of it. A poster in the background of a scene in an episode that most people watch for the Artie Ziff story, about a film that did not exist and had not been announced, with a detail pointing at a holiday release window that turned out to be accurate. None of it was supposed to matter. None of it was supposed to be seen by more than a handful of people who happened to have a pause button and a reason to use it. It was just a piece of background decoration in a single episode of a cartoon. 17 years later, it was everywhere. The Ziff Who Came to Dinner aired on March 14th, 2004. Most people who remember it at all remember it as the Artie Ziff episode. The one where Marge's embarrassing former prom date turns up hiding in the attic and causes chaos for the Simpson family. It is a funny episode with a good performance from Jon Lovitz and some sharp jokes about wealth and fraud and the particular kind of desperate energy that comes from a man who has never accepted that the best moment of his life is behind him. And in the background of one scene, on a wall that nobody was supposed to look at too closely, was a poster for a film that would not exist for another 17 years. Released at exactly the time of year that a cartoon Santa hat had been quietly pointing at all along. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if a background poster predicting a sequel film that did not exist yet has your head spinning just a little, the last entry on this list brings the whole story home. Because it is about a man who won a prize that the show predicted he would win, 6 years before the committee that gives that prize had made their decision. Section 12. The name nobody was supposed to notice. There is a difference between a lucky guess and an informed one. A lucky guess is random. You pick a number between 1 and 100, someone tells you the answer, and you happen to be right. There is no skill in it, no knowledge, no process. Just the blind fortune of landing on the correct answer without any real reason to have done so. Lucky guesses happen. They are memorable precisely because they have no explanation. You were right, and you do not know why, and neither does anyone else. An informed guess is different. An informed guess comes from somewhere. It comes from reading, from research, from paying attention to things that other people are not paying attention to, from understanding a subject well enough to look at a field of possibilities and narrow it down to something close to the truth. Informed guesses are still guesses. They can still be wrong. But when they turn out to be right, there is a logic to them, a thread you can trace back to the knowledge and the thinking that produced them. Most of the Simpsons predictions on this list sit somewhere between those two things. Sharp, well-read writers making informed guesses about trends and patterns and people, then watching as the world gradually walked toward the pictures they had drawn. There is always a thread to trace, even if the writers themselves did not know they were drawing it at the time. The last entry on this list is different from all the others, because this one did not come from a trend. It did not come from reading the political landscape, or understanding where technology was heading, or knowing how Hollywood worked. This one came from homework. Specific, deliberate, carefully done homework. And because of that homework, a cartoon correctly named a Nobel Prize winner 6 years before the prize was awarded. The episode was called Elementary School Musical. It was the first episode of the show's 22nd season, and it aired on September 26, 2010. The episode's main story follows the Simpsons children after they attend an arts camp over the summer and come back with new creative passions that their regular Springfield lives have no room for. It is a fun episode with a lot of energy, a parody of the High School Musical films that were enormously popular with young audiences at the time, and it moves quickly through its jokes with the efficiency the show was still capable of in its later years. The Nobel Prize prediction has nothing to do with the main story. It lives, as so many of the show's best moments do, in the margins, in the background, in a moment so brief and so casually placed that most people who watched the episode on the night it aired almost certainly did not register it as anything worth noting. The scene involves a brief exchange in which characters are discussing who might win that year's Nobel Prize in economics. The Nobel Prizes are awarded every year in October, and the conversation in the episode is framed around the excitement and anticipation of finding out who the committee has chosen. During this exchange, a name is mentioned. The name is Bengt Holmstrom. In 2010, Bengt Holmstrom was not a household name. He was extremely well known within the world of economics, where he had spent decades doing research that people in that field considered important and significant. He was a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, known as MIT, one of the most prestigious universities in the world for science and mathematics and economics. His work focused on how organizations design contracts and agreements, how businesses figure out the best ways to pay and motivate the people who work for them, and how these decisions play out in the real world. Important, serious work. The kind of work that the people who give out Nobel Prizes pay very close attention to. But outside of the world of professional economics, his name meant essentially nothing to most people. He was not famous. He was not a public figure in any meaningful sense. He was a respected academic doing respected academic work, invisible to the vast majority of people going about their daily lives, with no particular reason to follow the careers of economists at MIT, which makes it all the more remarkable that his name appeared in a Simpsons episode in 2010. 6 years later, in October 2016, the Nobel Committee announced the winner of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. The prize went to 2 economists. One of them was Oliver Hart from Harvard University. The other was Bengt Holmstrom from MIT. The man whose name had been dropped into a Simpsons episode as a throwaway reference in 2010 won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2016, 6 years after the cartoon. The same name, the same prize, the same field. When the announcement was made and people connected it back to the episode, the reaction followed the now familiar pattern. The clip spread online, articles were written, people who had seen the episode 6 years earlier and completely forgotten about it suddenly remembered that name from a background joke in a cartoon about an arts camp and a high school musical parody. But unlike most of the other predictions on this list, this one came with an explanation. Not a complete explanation, not something that takes all the strangeness out of it, but an actual account of where the name came from and why it ended up in the episode. And that explanation is, in its own way, just as interesting as the prediction itself. The Simpsons, as has been established across the history of this show, employed a significant number of writers with genuine academic backgrounds in mathematics and science. Several of them had studied at Harvard or MIT or other universities where serious research was happening across many fields, including economics. These were people who were embedded, at least historically, in the academic world. People who had friends and former colleagues still working in universities. People who stayed connected to academic conversations even after moving into television writing. When the writers wanted to make the Nobel Prize economics joke feel real and specific rather than vague and generic, they did not simply invent a name. They looked at actual lists of economists who were considered genuine candidates for the Nobel Prize in their field. They researched who the serious contenders were, who the people inside economics were talking about as likely future winners, who had been doing work significant enough to put them on the radar of the committee that made these decisions. Holmstrom's name was on those lists. He had been considered a potential Nobel Prize recipient within economics circles for years before 2010. The kind of research he had spent his career doing was exactly the kind of work that Nobel committees tended to recognize. People who followed economics closely knew his name and understood what he had contributed to the field. He was not a surprise candidate. He was a respected, well-regarded scholar whose work had been influential enough that serious people in his field had been talking about him as a possible future Nobel winner for a while. The Simpsons writers found his name on those lists, thought it worked well as a reference, and put it in the episode. They were not predicting the future. They were doing research and using what they found to make the joke feel grounded in something real. The fact that the joke turned out to be correct, that Holmstrom actually won the prize 6 years later, was not something anyone in that writer's room was counting on or expecting. They just picked a real name from a real list and happened to pick the right one. That distinction matters. It is the difference between a lucky guess and an informed one. The writers were informed. They knew enough about the field to find real candidates and use real names. And the real name they used turned out to belong to a man who would one day stand in Stockholm and receive one of the most prestigious awards in the world. There is something worth thinking about in the gap between 2010 and 2016. 6 years is a long time. Nobel Prizes in economics have been given out every year since 1969, and the list of people who have been serious candidates for the prize without ever winning it is long and distinguished. Being talked about as a likely future winner does not guarantee anything. The committee makes its own choices for its own reasons, and plenty of people who spent years as frontrunners never received the call. Holmstrom had been on the radar for years, but that alone did not mean the prize was coming. It just meant he was deserving of serious consideration. The Simpsons put his name in an episode in 2010. The committee made their decision independently in 2016. The two things were not connected. The cartoon did not cause the prize. The prize did not validate the cartoon. They are two separate events that happen to involve the same name, separated by 6 years, one the result of careful research by television writers looking for a good joke, the other the result of a deliberate and serious process conducted by one of the most respected committees in the world. And yet the name is the same. and the prize is the same. And the year the cartoon mentioned it and the year the prize was awarded are 6 years apart, which is a gap short enough that people who watched the episode in 2010 were still around and paying attention when the announcement came in 2016. Holmstrom himself has been gracious about the Simpsons connection in the years since. He is a serious man who spent his career doing serious work. And the idea of a cartoon having mentioned his name 6 years before his greatest professional achievement is the kind of thing that could easily feel trivial or beside the point. But he has handled the attention around it with good humor, which seems appropriate given the circumstances. What this last entry on the list does, more than anything else, is show the range of what the Simpsons predictions actually cover. From the enormous, world-changing events like a presidency and a pandemic, to the specific and verifiable like 3 Super Bowl winners in a row, to the cultural and visual like Lady Gaga flying over a crowd, to the scientific like a fish near a nuclear plant and an equation on a chalkboard, and finally to this, a single name dropped into a background joke, a real economist on a real list, winning a real prize 6 years after a cartoon mentioned him. The breadth of it is part of what makes the whole phenomenon so hard to dismiss entirely. It would be easier to explain away if all the predictions were in one category, all political, or all technological, or all cultural. The fact that they cover so many different areas of human life, from the biggest geopolitical events to the smallest academic awards, speaks to something real about what the show has always been doing. The writers have always been paying attention to everything. To politics and science and culture and economics and music and sport and corporate power and government behavior and the way technology changes how people live. All of it, all at once, for decades. And when you pay attention to everything for long enough, you start to see things. Not because you are psychic, not because you have access to information that nobody else has, but because the world moves in patterns, and if you watch those patterns carefully enough and for long enough, you start to understand where they are going before they get there. Bengt Holmstrom's name was on a list in 2010. It was on a much more important list in 2016, and in between those two dates, it lived quietly in the background of an episode of a cartoon about an arts camp and a high school musical parody, waiting for the world to catch up. Elementary School Musical aired on September 26, 2010. Most people who watched it remember it as the season premiere about arts camp and the high school musical jokes. A very small number of people noticed a name mentioned in passing during a background conversation about the Nobel Prize. 6 years later, that name was in every newspaper in the world, and with that, we have been through 12 moments. 12 times that a cartoon drew a picture of something that had not happened yet, and the world walked into the frame. But before we wrap this up entirely, there is one more thing worth sitting with. Because when you look at all 12 of these together, a question starts to form. Not about whether the writers were lucky, or smart, or both. A bigger question about what it means that a cartoon has been telling us the truth about our own world for over 30 years, and most of us have been watching it as entertainment. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.